coordinator for Alaska, and I work with the science team that for the most part resides in Seattle. This presentation was put together by my colleague Adriana, and basically what I'm going to do is just give you a little information. I call it the Dispersant 101. Okay, just a little information about dispersants and how they work, and then a little bit about what we know about their toxicity. And that being said, I'm going to stick with acute toxicity as opposed to more chronic impacts. Oops. So how do dispersants work? Basically, dispersants are a mixture of solvents, surfactants, and additives. Okay, they're designed to mix with the oil at the water surface, and then break that oil into smaller droplets and reduce the interfacial tension between the oil droplets to keep them apart. So they're designed to mix with the oil, break it into small droplets, and keep them in small droplets, which then become stable in the water column and don't come back together and reform as a slick. And Rick will talk a little bit about that slick reformation later in his talk. And then, so basically what you're seeing here across the top is a timeline from when the dispersants are initially applied, and you have that movement of the oil droplets into the water column, and then over a series of days to weeks, we get colonization of those dispersed oil droplets, and the bacteria begin to degrade and break them down, and then they sort of become part of that the microfauna food web in that water column. But chemical dispersion is only effective if you have that mixing energy, wind and waves, to mix that oil into the water column. If it's very calm, it's much more difficult to get that mixing, and that was one of those things that Matt talked about that we look for when we make that decision on whether or not to use them. Okay, he talked a little bit about environmental trade-offs. So we can call it the net environmental benefits analysis, that NEBA discussion, environmental trade-offs discussion. Doesn't really matter what you call it, but what we're trying to discern here is if we're going to use chemical dispersion, where are the impacts going to be, and what impacts are we trying to avoid, what things will be affected, and what things are we trying to avoid impacting. So when you have an oil slick on the water, that's already a bad thing. Oil is highly toxic. It's going to impact a number of different resources at the surface. You will get impacts to birds, marine mammals, and things that use the water surface. And if you leave it on the water surface and it moves toward the shore, then you're also going to have near-shore impacts. And once you have near-shore impacts, then you have to start thinking about how you're going to clean that up and remediate those impacts. But if you disperse it offshore, you are also potentially have impacts offshore from that dispersed oil affecting things that are in the water column. So what we need to look at if we have an oil spill is what things are out there at this time of year, what's in the water column below that slick potentially, what is in the nearshore environment, what is at the surface, and so then we want to try to balance to see where the worst impact could be. So some of the advantages of dispersant use: it will reduce the exposure to the workers who could potentially be recovering oil at the surface. It will reduce impacts to shoreline habitats if we can disperse it offshore in deep water and prevent it from coming into the nearshore environment. It will minimize impacts to wildlife populations that are using that water surface, such as birds and otters. It will reduce exposure of cetaceans that are breathing those vapors above an oil slick, potentially. It will remove the oil from the surface, moving it into the water column. And that in turn will lead to a facilitation of that biodegradation that we saw on that first slide. So here's what we really want to try to prevent. That oil from coming ashore, where now we could, try to clean it up, and where we can potentially have more impacts from the cleanup of those environments. So nearshore oil cleanup can be very invasive, especially when you're talking about sensitive environments like marshes. And those nearshore habitats recover very slowly from oiling and from those cleanup impacts as well. Some of the disadvantages of dispersant use. Dispersants temporarily increase that concentration and the bioavailability of those hydrocarbons in the water column. And when you think about this, it really is restricted to where you apply that dispersant on that slick, okay? If you're not dispersing the slick, you're not going to get that concentration of oil into the water column. The initial spike concentrations may reach toxic levels we usually say the top 10 meters of the water column, because really that's where we can detect it. But within that top 10 meters, down when you start getting down to 10 meters, you're down to 1 part per million or less. So that really spiked concentration is mostly in the 5 meter or less depth of that water column. You're going to get increased localized risk of exposure to less mobile species and life stages, such as fish, invertebrate eggs, and plankton, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more further on. And dispersants increase that volumetric footprint. So basically you're taking that footprint of oil at the surface and now pushing it down into the water column in the very immediate sense, but it's going to begin to disperse fairly quickly after that happens. So when we apply dispersants to an oil slick, what we're looking for is achieving this dense brown cloud within that upper water column. Okay, that's what we want to see happen. That tells us that that dispersant is working on that oil slick. So the oil breaks up into very small droplets. The waves mix it down into the water column, and within those first few feet, you're going to have that dispersed oil droplet concentration of about 100 parts per million. Then, and that's within the first few seconds of applying that dispersant. Within minutes to hours, it's going to go from this sort of color to this more white color, be less visible, and it's going to be spreading vertically and horizontally as soon as you put it into the water column, as long as you have that mixing energy. And the oil concentrations within minutes to hours are going to go down from 1 to 100 parts per million in that upper several feet. And then within several hours, you're not going to hardly see anything at all. It's going to be very hard to see, and your oil concentrations are going to be less than 1 part per million. So it happens fairly rapidly as it disperses and moves vertically and horizontally into the water column. And so this is just a depiction of what dispersed oil looks like in a very closed environment. So what we have here on the left is salt water and Louisiana crude oil. And on this jar on the right, we have a mixture of salt water, Louisiana crude, and dispersant Corex at 9500. So basically, both of these jars were shaken very vigorously and then set down and allowed to sit for 10 minutes. And then the picture was taken. And so what you can see is you can see very large oil droplets in that water column. And they're starting to, again, rise and stick together and form a slick on the surface. Okay, so you still have dispersed oil in the water column, not as dense as this, but you're starting to get a slick reforming. On this side, where you have the Corex that mixed with the oil, it's cloudy because those are very, very tiny droplets of oil, okay? And all of the oil is in the water column with very little coming back to the surface of that jar. So this row of jars right here is just to give you an idea of what those concentrations would look like over time. Okay, so within seconds of dispersing to days after a dispersant has been used. Within the jar, you can't get that dispersing and movement within the water column. So this is what it would look like right after it was dispersed. This is what it would look like within a few minutes when it gets down to about 1,000 parts per million. And then over minutes to hours, 100 parts per million, down to 10 parts per million. And then basically after a few days, less than 1 part per million. Okay, that doesn't mean that this went to this. That's just showing you what those parts per million look like, to give you a little bit of a visual. And if you take that same row of jars and you just allow them to sit over time in an enclosed space, in an 8-month period, that degradation is going to continue, particularly when you have less than 100 parts per million. You can see that the degradation continues over time without even opening the jar and mixing it anymore. You know, it's just a closed space. So aquatic species are exposed to dispersed oil, but not all species are exposed equally, and it really depends on where they occupy, where they live in the water column, and seasonally, whether or not they're even there. So I want to talk a little bit about that upper water column where you have a very mobile biota. This is just an example. Here's some birds and whales and like schooling fish, okay? And then in the bottom, what we call in the bottom of the benthic resources, you have less mobile things like crabs and fish that live on the bottom, don't move around as much, you know, less free swimming, occupy just a very small area. And then things that don't hardly move at all, such as corals and sponges. And so when you think about that water column going from the top down to the bottom, and in some cases when we're looking at 24 miles out, very, very deep areas, you know, you have what we call a very acute short-term exposure. If these were shallower areas, so within less than 10 meters, which we don't like to disperse in, but if you did have a dispersant in something that was less than 10 meters going from the top to the bottom, that toxicity would increase, or they would be at a greater risk of exposure, okay? But at 24 miles out with that depth of water, very likely that things that live or survive near the bottom would not likely be exposed to any kind of dispersant. It would be more in the upper water column. That being said, you do have things that are entrained in that water column and drifting with the currents near the surface, such as plankton, larvae, fish larvae, and eggs, okay? And not very mobile. They're mobile because they're moving with the currents, but they can't like swim away like schooling fish can. And these would experience what we call acute and long-term exposure, but declining as the exposure declining as that the concentrations of dispersed oil decline over time, horizontally and vertically. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call lethality curves or acute toxicity curves, but I want to explain briefly what I'm talking about with this example right here. So on this axis we have percentage of mortality, and then on this axis you will usually see a concentration of whatever the chemical is that you're looking at, okay? And then we expose biota to this chemical, and the higher it or the further it gets along this axis before it dies, the less sensitive it's considered to be. And this is called an LC50 curve, and what you're going to see is that 50% of the population dies at this concentration within some kind of a time span, and usually it's 48, 96 hours. Here we're showing 96 hours. So when you're talking about an LC50 or a lethal concentration 50, you're talking about something where the 50% of the population dies within that 96-hour exposure time frame, okay? And so this just gives you a little bit of scale here. The smaller the LC50 value, the greater, we call it the greater the toxicity or the more sensitive that species or animal is, okay? So something that dies where you get an LC50 of less than 0.1, it would be considered very highly toxic, whereas an LC50 of 10 to 100 milligrams per liter would be considered slightly toxic. Okay, so it's just a scale of relativity that I wanted to show you here. So when we look at comparisons of what we call common household products, which you see at this end of the scale, and then we compare it to something like Corexit 9527 right here on the scale, and then this is where Corexit 9500 would fall on the scale. And for this particular test, they were looking at rainbow trout LC50 at 96 hours. And so what you're seeing here is a decreased toxicity as we go across the scale this way. So some household products are very highly toxic, whereas in comparison, the 9500 is not very toxic when you're talking about something like a rainbow trout. Okay, so but what we do want to convey is it's the oil itself that is very highly toxic. Okay, and the dispersant that we're using does not increase the toxicity of the oil, but what is happening is you're taking that very highly toxic oil and putting it into the water column at a high concentration near that water surface, okay? That's what we're trying to convey here. So let's just look at a few typical LC or toxicity curves here. Again, the proportion of species on this, so you're looking at that 50% mark going across right about through here. And this right here is the oil, okay, I'm sorry. The dispersant is indicated by the purple line. And the dispersed oil, so the dispersant plus oil, is indicated by the blue line, and you can see that even for those very sensitive species, dispersed oil is more toxic than the dispersant alone. And for the most part, we're talking about slightly to moderately toxic for most of the species that was tested. So this was 9500 and this was 9527, which was a little bit more toxic than the 9500. So what are some of the strengths limitations of the toxicity data that we have? The strengths, most of the estimates of risk are very conservative. Those toxicity data allow us to compare the sensitivity of different species and the sensitivity of the different test types. And they also allow us to develop what we call surrogate data for species of unknown toxicity. So if we know that the species that we have done the test on is very sensitive, and then we know that this other species that we haven't done the test on is also very sensitive, we may be able to use that as a surrogate species because they're both highly sensitive to other things that they've been tested on. Some of the limitations: do not capture environmental realism. So most of the tests that are conducted on those species are conducted in an enclosed environment that doesn't allow that concentration to continue to decrease over time. We have the unknown, when we don't test a species, we really don't know that sensitivity to that particular compound, although we can sometimes infer it. And conclusions in the scientific literature can be very confusing at times. And Rick is going to talk a little bit more about that. So we do have a very limited dispersant and oil toxicity data for species of cold water regions. And you can see the number of unique records for something like tropical and temperate zones versus the unique records for cold water species. Okay, so we don't have a lot of data on cold water species, but we do have some that allows us to use surrogate data. However, the data are becoming more available because we continue to do work and do do tests every year. We do a little bit more. Some of the commonly tested Arctic species include copepods, Arctic cod, and sculpin. And these have been tested because they are ecologically important and occupy different portions of the food web. They're relatively easy to handle and culture. They're relatively sensitive to the contaminants, which is really important. We want to make sure that we're testing them on sensitive species. And the toxicity data for these species allow us to use them as comparisons for other non-tested Arctic species or non-Arctic species where we know the sensitivities are similar. So in summary, we have limited toxicity data for Arctic species relative to data for temperate and tropical zones, and we've always known that. Only a handful of Arctic species have been used in toxicity testing. There are ongoing studies right now, but we don't have the data. Those haven't been completed yet. The data do suggest that there are similar sensitivities, and Rick will talk about the WAF versus the CWAF, the water accommodated fraction of the oil in the water column versus the chemically enhanced water column. So you saw those two jars, where you could see the big oil droplets and then the dense cloud of the very tiny droplets. The big droplets were what we call the water accommodated fraction of oil, and then the very tiny cloud of droplets was the chemically enhanced
have entered the conference.
Water accommodated fraction between Arctic and, so we know there are similar sensitivities between Arctic and non-Arctic species. Basically, all we've done on Arctic species is acute toxicity testing. We haven't done a lot with what we call chronic toxicity tests, which look at sublethal endpoints. So we don't have any sublethal endpoint type data for Arctic species. And here's just a list of references that we use to look at some of the data. And at this point, I can take any questions you might have on what we know about dispersants, and then Rick will add more information on how we know some of this stuff. Do you have any questions right now? Do you want to know who's on the phone?
Yeah, we'll just ask.
Can you tell us who just joined on the phone, please?
It was that guy, got cut off.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, just wondering if you might be able to speak to how long some of these dispersants have been used or what the history of dispersant use is.
Okay, so the question was, how long have dispersants been used and the frequency with which they're used? I don't know the answer to the first one, but the second one, not very frequently, and just, the most recent case, of course, being the Deepwater Horizon, where they did use dispersants of oil on the oil slick at the surface, and they introduced dispersants into the plume as it was coming out of the pipe. And this is, a lot of information was gathered during studies during that incident. And Rick will go into a little bit more detail.
I'll get back to you.
Okay, sure.
Once you've added the dispersants, can you still mechanically clean it up, or?
The question was, can we mechanically clean up oil that has been dispersed? And Rick will talk about that, but for the most part, what's been dispersed into the water column, no. And anything that does recollate on the surface, not very easily. Is that sort of a brief answer? And Rick is going to cover that a little bit more if you want to wait for part two.
I'll wait for part two.
Okay. And with that, I think we can go into part two.
I'm going to take a stretch.
Oh, okay. We're going to take a break before we hit part two.
Part two's got a lot of numbers and facts and details.
Want you to be, you want to be fresh.